The house felt larger at night, as if the walls stretched when the lights went out. Ethan Walker lay on his bed staring at the faint glow of his phone screen, listening to the low hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of old wood settling. His parents were away for the weekend, the kind of quiet absence that should have felt freeing. Instead, it pressed on him, heavy and unresolved, like a question he had been avoiding for too long that he turned the phone face down and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. It hadn't since Megan started talking about the future with a certainty that made his chest tighten. She was kind, patient, and deeply invested in them, and that was the problem. Ethan cared for her, truly, but lately their conversations felt rehearsed, as if he were playing a role he had once agreed to without fully understanding the script. Earlier that evening, Megan had called him from her apartment. Her voice had been warm, familiar, and distant all at once. She talked about plans, trips they could take, changes they could make, the way things would look a year from now. Ethan had listened, offering responses that sounded right, while a quiet part of him drifted elsewhere. When she asked if he was still there, he'd laughed softly and said yes, feeling the lie settle uncomfortably in his stomach. After the call ended, he sat in the dark longer than necessary, trying to trace when the space between them had grown so wide. It wasn't anger or betrayal that divided them, just a gradual thinning of connection. He didn't know how to explain that to her without sounding ungrateful, or worse, confused that a muted sound from down the hall pulled him back. Footsteps. Familiar ones. Lucas Walker moved through the house with an easy confidence, never trying to be quiet, never trying to be loud. Ethan could always tell it was him. They had lived under the same roof for 2 years now, ever since Ethan's father remarried, and still the presence of his stepbrother unsettled him in ways he hadn't learned to name. Lucas wasn't what Ethan had expected when they first met. He was older by a year, sharper around the edges, with an observant calm that made people talk more than they intended. He didn't overshare, but he noticed everything. The way Ethan avoided certain topics. The way he lingered at doorways as if deciding whether to enter or retreat. Lucas had a habit of holding eye contact a second longer than necessary, not aggressively, just long enough to make Ethan aware of himself. During dinner that night, Lucas had barely spoken. He'd pushed food around his plate, listening while Ethan filled the silence with small talk. Their parents had already left, suitcases loaded into the car, instructions given about trash days and locked doors. Once they were gone, the house shifted. Lucas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying Ethan with a thoughtful expression that made him lose his train of thought mid-sentence. "What?" Ethan had asked, defensive without knowing why. "Nothing," Lucas replied, lips curving slightly. "You just seem tired." It was a simple observation, but it landed too close to the truth. Ethan shrugged it off, cleared the table, and retreated to his room sooner than usual. He told himself it was exhaustion, that everything felt heavier because he'd been overthinking again. That was his pattern, name the feeling something manageable and move on. Now, in the quiet, his thoughts circled back to Lucas despite his efforts. He remembered the first week they lived together, the awkward politeness, the careful boundaries. Over time, those boundaries had softened. Late-night conversations in the kitchen. Shared jokes that no one else heard. Moments when Lucas seemed to understand him without explanation, and that understanding frightened him. Ethan shifted onto his side, pulling the blanket higher. He tried to picture Megan's smile, the steadiness she offered, the life she imagined for them. It should have been enough. He wanted it to be enough. Instead, another image intruded, Lucas leaning against the doorway earlier that evening, arms folded, eyes unreadable, as if he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. A floorboard creaked again, closer this time. Ethan's eyes opened. The sound stopped just outside his room. He held his breath, listening, suddenly aware of how thin the walls were, how exposed he felt. He told himself Lucas was just heading to the bathroom, or getting a glass of water. Normal things. Harmless things. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. Ethan exhaled slowly, tension loosening from his shoulders. He turned onto his back and stared at the ceiling, counting breaths, trying to let his mind settle. The quiet returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. As his eyelids finally grew heavy, one thought lingered, uninvited and persistent: whatever was shifting inside him could no longer be ignored. The house was silent again, yet something had already begun, subtle and irreversible, waiting just beyond the closed door. Night settled slowly over the house, bringing with it a hush that felt deliberate rather than peaceful. Ethan Miller stood at the kitchen sink long after Daniel Brooks had left, watching his reflection blur in the darkened glass. He replayed the visit in fragments, the pauses, the careful words, the way Daniel had lingered as if time itself had loosened its grip. Nothing improper had happened, and yet Ethan felt as though a boundary had shifted under his feet. Sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it was light and restless, threaded with half-formed thoughts and unfinished conversations. Morning arrived with a thin gray light and the muted sounds of the neighborhood waking. Ethan brewed coffee he barely tasted and told himself that the unease would fade once the day began. Instead, it followed him from room to room like a shadow that refused to detach. His phone buzzed near noon. The name on the screen made his chest tighten before he could stop himself. Daniel, hope today's going well. I realized I forgot to ask, are you doing okay? Ethan stared at the message longer than necessary. The question was gentle, almost casual, yet it felt intimate in a way that startled him. He typed and erased his reply twice before settling on something neutral. Ethan, yeah. Just taking it easy. The dots appeared almost immediately. Daniel, if you're free later, I could stop by again. Just to talk. Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. He thought of his father's easy trust, of the photograph in the living room, of how uncomplicated life had seemed before the doorbell rang the day before. Yet beneath those thoughts was another, quieter truth. He wanted Daniel to come back. Okay, Ethan typed, then set the phone down as if it might burn him. The afternoon passed slowly. Ethan cleaned the house with unnecessary thoroughness, straightening things that were already in place. When the knock finally came, it was softer than before, as though Daniel were unsure of his welcome. Ethan opened the door to find him holding 2 paper cups of coffee, his expression unreadable. I thought we could use these, Daniel said. They sat at opposite ends of the dining table, the cups cooling between them. Conversation began cautiously, both men skirting the edges of what had drawn them together. Daniel spoke about work pressures he hadn't shared with anyone else, about the exhaustion of being dependable to everyone except himself. Ethan listened, recognizing the weight behind the words. I don't usually say this kind of thing, Daniel admitted, staring into his cup. It's easier to keep moving. Ethan nodded. I know what you mean. The admission hung between them, fragile and sincere. As the minutes passed, the distance across the table seemed less deliberate and more symbolic, a reminder of rules neither had named but both understood. Ethan became acutely aware of how carefully Daniel chose his words, how often he paused as if measuring the cost of honesty. I should be clear, Daniel said eventually. I don't want to complicate things. Ethan's heart sank and lifted at the same time. Neither do I. They shared a small, rueful smile. The irony was not lost on either of them. The complication had already begun, not through action but through attention, through the simple fact of being seen too clearly by someone who should have remained safely distant. As evening crept in again, the conversation slowed, deepened. They spoke less about themselves and more about moments, missed chances, quiet regrets, the feeling of standing just outside a life that never quite opened its door. Ethan realized how rarely he spoke like this to anyone, how easily Daniel seemed to understand without demanding explanation. At one point, Daniel reached across the table to adjust a napkin that had slipped near Ethan's hand. The gesture was small, almost accidental, yet Ethan felt it everywhere. Daniel withdrew his hand just as quickly, his jaw tightening. Sorry, he said. It's fine, Ethan replied, though his voice betrayed him. Silence returned, heavier now, edged with awareness. Daniel stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the darkened street. I should go, he said, more firmly than before. Ethan didn't argue. He followed Daniel to the door, the space between them charged with restraint. For a moment, it seemed as though one of them might say something irreversible, but instead Daniel only nodded, his expression composed but strained. This can't happen, Daniel said quietly, not specifying what this was. Ethan swallowed. I know. Daniel left without lingering this time. The door closed, and Ethan leaned against it, the house once again reclaiming its silence. Yet the quiet felt altered, as if it carried an echo of everything that had been left unsaid. Later that night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He knew they had stopped short of crossing a line, but the knowledge brought little comfort. Emotional truths, once revealed, could not be tucked back into hiding. Somewhere beyond the walls of the house, Daniel was likely wrestling with the same thoughts, the same pull. Ethan turned onto his side, aware that whatever restraint had guided them tonight was fragile at best. The story between them had not ended at the door, it had only learned to wait.